Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a huge pleasure to be back in Coventry, seemingly after a long while. It's been a long flight to get here, so please excuse the bags under the eyes. But I've just got back in from Tokyo, and you can see from the video that the weather when I was announcing the autonomous car was somewhat better than it was in Coventry this morning. Anyway, so the long introduction, thank you very much. The most important thing to know is I'm a lad from Stratford-on-Avon, and as a 16 and 17, 18, 19 year old I studied here, and it's a great pleasure to be back here. We'll skip the job description. Let me start by giving a little bit of context about Nissan. Nissan, you'll know as a Japanese company, but it's interesting that half of the people in the top 100 of the company are in fact non-Japanese and come from 14 different cultures and countries around the world. It's probably the most international car company in the world, and I'm honored to say that within the sort of five top people of the company, one is my boss, who's difficult to pin him down, but is Lebanese come Brazilian come French. Probably have to strike that from the recording. There's my colleague in charge of what we call Monozukuri, who's Japanese. There's my colleague in charge of the region, who's another Brit. There's the CFO. You always need an accountant in a company, unfortunately. Sorry, Joe. He's an American, and myself as a local lad from around here. So as you see, a very, very diverse and international culture. Obviously, we're remarkably proud of the achievements that have been made in Sunderland, where we have our major factory. Sunderland produces over 500,000 cars every year. It, in fact, as a factory, produces more cars than the whole of Italy altogether, and is obviously a huge contributor to the wealth of this company. And that's part of what Nissan is about bringing motor cars to society, making them in the countries that we sell, and creating local jobs. So our plan that we're in right now is called Power 88. It's a 6-year plan, and it's all about growth. It's about growth of profitability. It's about growth of volume, and in that creation of volume, today we're in the throes of constructing 9 new factories around the world, in everywhere as diverse as Mexico, Brazil, China, Thailand, and of course here in the UK with expansion of the capability in Sunderland. As maybe at another time, and one of the things that I like to lecture on in terms of management skills is a technique that we use inside Nissan and certainly inside many companies called Hoshinkanri. It's policy deployment, and it's a way of fitting your daily operations and matching it to the long-term aims of the company. Our long-term aim is basically 8% operating profit, important for the accountants, but also important for me as the Chief Planning Officer, because it's that profitability that allows us to reinvest in the new vehicles and the new factories. So 8% operating profit would put Nissan at the upper end of profit for mass car companies. An 8% market share. So basically 8% of the cars sold around the world would be a Nissan. And to put that into context, there are about 84 million cars sold every year right now. So fairly significant volume, about 7 million cars a year. It's built on 6 pillars. The first is brand power. It's about improving the value of the brand, making sure that Nissan is among those top 3 to 5 cars that everybody has top of the mind. And of course, basically making sure that people understand what you stand for. And it'll be a theme of this lecture that what Nissan wants to stand for is zero emissions and zero fatalities, which is executed through the electric car and the autonomous driving car. The second is sales power, because there's no point in having brand power unless it's a pleasure to go to the dealers. And in fact, we'll talk a lot about the types of people and the trends of people buying cars in the future. Enhancing quality. Quality is somewhere a given, but we need to be, as a Japanese company, at the top level. Zero emissions, which is obviously apparent in Nissan's leadership through the sale of the Nissan Leaf. Business expansion. By the end of the 6-year plan, we'll sell our vehicles in 92% of the world's segments. So if you consider every segment in every country around the world, we'll be selling a vehicle in 92% of those. We won't be selling cars in North Korea. And finally, cost leadership, because this industry is all about keeping your costs at the right level. Margins are thin, and if you want to get to 8% profitability, then there has to be a focus on costs. What does that mean? That means over the period of the plan, we'll launch 51 cars, which means that we're launching one new car, not a minor change, not a trim change, one brand new car every 6 weeks, which is interesting as a car guy. I have two of my 4 children down the front, down here, and they don't see too much of their dad, because normally there's a car to be launched somewhere in the world about every 2 weeks. So when you're doing a car every 6 weeks, obviously it's in 2 or 3 factories around the world, or 2 or 3 markets around the world. That's pretty much one car launch every 2 weeks. How's it going? My boss would say probably not good enough, but we keep trying. You can see that since the Lehman shock in 2009, sales have gone from 3.5 million cars, and we're currently this year expecting to land at 5.2 million cars. On profitability, which of course is what pays for the investments, against that 8% that we're aiming at, today we're running at about 8.4% operating profit. So still some way to go, but that's pretty much anyway at the top end of the mass car market. It's not a bad return. But it also tells you how tight margins are in this business compared to pharmaceuticals, for example. Okay, so the boring bit's over. What's our industry going to go through over the next few years? I would argue that the car industry is probably going to go through the most significant change in 125 years since the motor car was invented. The technology is taking us there, and society is taking us there. I'll talk a little bit about those mega trends, and this is my personal view on trying to group together trends from a society point of view and from a technical point of view, and perhaps how that will shape society through till 2050. Certainly cars won't be as we've seen them through the past 125 years since the advent of the Mercedes-Benz. So I'm going to step through both the social trends and then the technology trends, and then talk about a little bit about the green space, because the green space is where the innovation is really going to happen, where the way that we move people around the planet is really going to change, where some of those things that seem like sci-fi really will become reality. And we can debate and we can argue whether we perceive them as good things or bad things. We can debate whether we even think they happen. Certainly I get to read plenty of blogs from people saying that they could never imagine handing over control to a car rather than driving it by themselves. But I hope this evening that I'll be able to put a compelling argument why it makes far more sense at least to have a computer running in the background taking care of you. I hope I convince you. What I'm sure is it will be part of the future. Okay, let's start with society trends, and I group them in the first instance into mega cities. You don't have to go further than India or China to see these mega cities springing up all of the time, but they're changing the way in which society lives. By 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in a city. That's up from today at 50%. Now, if you think about that, and you think about places like Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, cities like Mumbai, even cities like London, and you think about the quality of the air in those cities today, and think about the health risks associated with that, now 70% of the world's population is going to be breathing that air. It's not sustainable. The impact on people's health makes it non-sustainable. Now couple that with perhaps the next slide. This is the growth of automobiles over the next few years through to 2050. Today we sell 84, this year we'll sell 84 million cars around the world. By 2050, it'll be 200 million cars. Now, imagine the congestion in London, or even Coventry, or actually even Warwick, as I drove through today. Imagine that being multiplied many times over. And imagine what that does, not only to congestion, but air quality, without going into the impact on CO2 and how that impacts upon the planet. Those two facts coupled together, I believe, mean that the automobile as we see it today can't continue in the same mode as it is today. Can we stop the cars? I don't think so. The statistic up there is that today in the United States, 774 people, I don't know who comes up with these statistics, 774 people out of 1,000 in the US own and drive an automobile. In the UK, it's 566. In China, it's 47, and in India, it's 31. There's no way that those people living in those societies will reject the automobile. As you have the rising middle classes, as automobiles become more affordable, everybody wants a car. The growth of the automobile is in those societies, and clearly that is going to lead to that 200 millions of sales and that congestion and that air pollution and that contribution to CO2. And again, with that kind of growth, it's not sustainable to stay as we are. Strangely though, people are actually driving less mileage. Maybe it's the congestion, I don't know. But you can see the significant reduction in the miles done per day. And you can see that actually UK was one of the most. I actually did the calculation on the aeroplane on the way here, how many miles or kilometers per day that turns into. But you know what, I've forgotten the number, so it tells you I was probably drinking too much wine. But I think it's around about 38 kilometers a day. That makes it interesting anyway, because when you think about the range, even today, of an electric car, it does around 100 kilometers, 160 if we're going to be precise, kilometers a day. 39% of the population in Europe never, and I do mean never, does more than 100 kilometers a day. So already today, even with today's technology, things like electric cars already logically make sense. So if we think about megacities then, the sheer density and sprawl of the megacities will give rise to new opportunities in the way that goods and services move. And this is obviously going to change the way we think about transportation through these cities. And my colleagues in Renault will be pleased to see that I took a picture of Paris. Okay, let's move on to the next trend. Youth. You guys. Actually, many of the students in the room, you're on the cusp of two generations. What the market intelligence guys like to call Gen Y, and I'm sorry to use the Americanism, but Gen Z. So for the 16 and 17-year-olds in the room, maybe two, I'm not sure. These guys are Gen Zs or Gen Zs. The majority of the rest of you are Gen Ys, and there's a few older people in the room that we won't go into. But they don't matter. They're not buying cars in the future. You guys are buying cars in the future, and you think about cars differently from me. Now, this is me having my midlife crisis, because this is what used to, I was going to say turn me on, but I'm not sure I should say that about Britt Etland. But this is what used to make me tick as a baby boomer when I was dreaming of my car for the future. And how I used to think. I used to dream of a Lamborghini. Still never got to buy one, but I did eventually get to buy a Scirocco at one moment. I don't know whether you guys remember these things. There was a time when we didn't download music, believe it or not, and we used to play them on little black discs. The time when a little football team called Leeds United was actually quite good. That's outside of living history. And when I used to go and listen to The Clash, which is a punk band, which I can probably persuade my son to listen to, but probably nobody else in the room. What turns on Gen Zs, I'm going to get this wrong because I'm bound to get this wrong, but the music has changed a bit. I don't know whether One Direction is currently cool or not, but anyway, it was the closest I could get on the internet in preparing this slide. Certainly, the Gen Z cares more about the phone and the computer, and I was going to say Facebook, but actually not Facebook anymore, because already the trends have moved on, and Facebook isn't that cool anymore. But certainly social networking, and basically just being a part of a digital society. It's a very different world to the one that I grew up in. So that's where you can generate, that's where you can compartmentalize. You can decide which group you belong to. So 0 to 17 actually is Gen Z. The millennials or the Gen Ys, 17 to 35, and the rest of us are somewhere up there. I'm actually 50 years old, but I actually prefer to call myself as a Gen X rather than a baby boomer. But apparently, I slipped the wrong side of the wrong side of the line. Okay, so we're talking about the youth. We're talking about the Gen Z, because Gen Z will represent the majority of the buyers in the future, and have a very different way of looking at the world. Obviously, both Gen Y and Gen Z, very much web use is part of the way that you think. And obviously that drives us to the belief that connected cars are vital. The fact that you can spend time in the car, not wasting your time driving, but actually being connected to your social network, becomes an important reason for buying the car. Facebook is one of the ways of communicating, but actually not that cool anymore, and hence you see the rise of things like Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat, whatever that is. Apparently it makes your photographs disappear after 7 seconds. I can do that all by myself. Moving on. Other important points of the way that this group thinks is basically, whilst probably still interested in cars, a lot of stress around the inconvenience in car, the fact that when you drive you can't text or social media, that somewhere cars can become a little bit of a burden because you've got to find somewhere to park, worrying about the accidents, worrying about the insurance, and actually looking forward to the prospect of a self-driving car. An issue for us, though, is that license holders are declining. People are driving, people are taking their license, their test much later. And this is one of the trends that the industry needs to face up to. Whilst we can see growth in those emerging markets in societies like the West, like the US, like Japan, people actually taking their licenses much later. And one of my jobs is to try to find a way of bringing vehicles that appeal to youth. Okay, the opposite end of society. Clive. The seniors. Very important. Consumption, available cash is there, and the purchasing power of so-called seniors is much greater. Seniors actually like spending money on car, and there's a lot of new businesses emerging around senior citizens because we're living longer and we're wealthier. So you see things in healthcare, in residence, and in travel. But you see that basically the car figures fairly high in terms of senior consumption. This gives you some statistics that help demonstrate that. You see that basically car consumption is rising among the senior group. We also see that more senior people are more loyal to the brand. So one of the reasons why Nissan puts the brand so strongly is that people of my age will more likely come back to repurchase of the brand. Next. Okay, the last megatrend, and probably the most important megatrend from a society point of view, is the empowered female. This is actually the biggest segment in the world. I always knew my wife was more powerful than me, but apparently the rest of the world is seeing this emergence of female buying power. And you can see it put into the graph here in terms of female employment rates around the world and the growth of female disposable income. It's a kind of very average number, but if you look at the female influence on any purchase, it's about 70%. And if you think about the emerging societies with female power in China, in India, in Brazil, basically more women are buying cars. Interestingly, no great surprise, I suppose, but women look at cars differently. And frankly speaking, the car industry, which is mainly full of men, does a great injustice and disservice to female customers. In fact, I'll talk a little bit later in the lecture, but if you look to the US just for some statistics, about 74% of women are dissatisfied with basically the usage of their cars. I do mean their cars and not their lovers, by the way. But it may be the same statistic. But it's interesting that from a society point of view, the way that females use the car and think of the car is very different. Still, women rate family as the most important thing in their life. But at the same time, many females are working, looking after the family, looking after the house for one reason or another. And it pretty much becomes a 24/7 job, and therefore need to think about how the car actually becomes an aid to that kind of workload that the women in society around the world are actually doing, whether it be it working, be it picking up the kids from school, be it anything that contributes to that cycle is really important, and cars can. Cars can be engineered in a way that helps the workload of females and therefore becomes attractive. Okay, let's look at the technology trend, and I'll divide these into three. So the first is zero emissions. I guess it's fairly self-explanatory. Zero emissions means no tailpipe. There are only two technologies out there right now that allow that to happen. One is battery electric cars, the other is fuel cell cars. I'll argue that battery electric is going to be more prevalent, particularly as the speed of development of the battery basically takes off according to Moore's law. But certainly Nissan also sees a role for fuel cell, and we're actually part of a three-way joint venture with Ford and Daimler in the development of a fuel cell electric car to be launched around 2018. We use that technology also to contribute to low CO2 with things like hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and range extender types of technologies. We're fairly agnostic in the use of low carbon, but we're, as Nissan and as Renault, religious about the use of zero emission cars. The widest selling electric car on the market today is the Leaf. The Renault-Nissan Alliance has invested 4 billion euros in the development of the electric car, and we've done that because of those mega trends that I've explained earlier. We sincerely believe that it is the future, and those mega cities with those populace, with those empowered sectors of society, will inevitably end up driving an electric car. So how's it going? We can skip this one. To date, we've sold 100,000, I think it was January the 22nd, we sold 100,000 Leafs. Later this year, we'll launch the van and what will eventually be the taxi to expand that portfolio. And between Nissan and Renault, we envisage that by around 2020, 1.5 million electric vehicles will be on the road, just from us, let alone our competition. Okay, somewhere connected with electric cars, because every Leaf is connected to the internet, is the connected cars. And I come back here to appealing to the youth that I talked about, the females that I talked about, but even to the seniors that I talked about. The seniors, of course, are trying to track down their kids on Facebook who are no longer using Facebook. But a connected vehicle is important from many, many ways. It allows us to stay in touch on those social networks, but also allows us to drive capability within the autonomous car. The amount of data in society has just exploded. The graph, which goes back, I believe, in Japanese. Sorry about the Japanese characters on here, but I think it's before Christ. I'm not sure who E is, but maybe it was Christ's middle name. I'm not sure, but you can see the amount of data. There's more data being created since 2000 and onwards than's been created since the beginning of society. The amount of data that we have at our disposal is just enormous. Now that data, so-called big data, is incredibly valuable for everybody, but for car companies, it tells us essentially how our consumer is using the cars and helps us to make better cars for you. But it also allows you to be able to do things that you could never do in the car before, like use social networks. Some of the ways of execution, and we're really at the start of a journey, but this is, Nissan has a luxury wing called Infinity. That's the new Infinity. That's the advert. It's the Q50. If anybody wants to buy it, please see me afterwards. But within that, there's essentially two touch screens, a bit like having two iPads in the center console. But basically on the center console you can access any level of social media that you want. Now the question for the auto industry of course is driver distraction, and how do you enable the use of those kinds of information without distracting the driver, or in fact doing exactly the opposite. How do you use that information to make driving safer? And that's one of the big challenges that faces the engineers today. One of our solutions for that is a concept called Friend Me, which is a concept car that was originally developed for China, exclusively for China. It now looks as if we can expand this car everywhere. It's a C-segment car. In one form or other it will come to production in our midterm. But basically this car originally was about appealing to the Balingho society, which is the one-child society in China. And we made actually two concept cars. We made one for guys and one for girls. This is the car for guys, and it basically has 4 cocoon spaces so that those one-child sons can spend time with their friends, because that's important to them, because they have no brothers and sisters, but at the same time is completely connected, so able to share social media between the seats and just flick content around the car in an electronic space, always connected, able to have that social interaction, either talking to each other or on the internet, sharing with a wider level of friends. An idea. Okay, now let's move to the autonomous car, which I suppose is probably the most exciting incarnation of technology, and again very much appealing to those big mega trends. Remember, the youth. There's no reason with an autonomous car why you shouldn't start driving a car at 15, 14, 12. There's no reason as a youth who's interested in social media that you shouldn't be able to spend time online, socially, talking to your friends in whatever medium is cool in 2020, rather than wasting that time basically sitting in a traffic jam. Think about the elderly, the seniors of society, who are much fitter than they used to be, but have to give up their license at a certain point in their life. Now we can extend the time when they can use the car, when you can have mobility until you're 85 or 95. So we give pride and dignity back to the seniors of society. Think of the empowered female that has that huge workload that she has to deal with every day of her life. Now we've freed up 1 or 2 hours of that commuting time when she can be doing other things, contributing to family. And wrap that up in the connected car and the zero-emission car, and you start to get a little bit of flavour of why Nissan believes that these technologies are really important and really game-changing in our society. Okay, so the autonomous car. Why do we need it? Here it's called from a survey which was done for the NASDAQ as the robot car, but they state contentiously, and this is United States figures, that robot cars are safer. I don't think that's very contentious. I think it's a fact. 32,000 people in the United States are killed in car accidents every year. 2.2 million are injured. Drink driving is responsible for nearly 10,000 deaths, and distracted driving kills 3,300 people. You know what? A computer never gets drunk. Not yet, anyway. Robots are more efficient. Traffic congestion today wastes 4.8 billion hours of people's times. It consumes 1.9 billion gallons of gas. Autonomous driving basically increases highway efficiency by 273%. With the autonomous car, as I said, the driver's license could simply disappear in the future. And to be frank, the autonomous car is already here. Do we think it's safe? Who would you rather have driving the car? By the way, the lady behind me is my mom. So I hope she never sees this recording. But the reality is that a computer, even today, can respond 100 times quicker than a human being. So in a terrible incident where you lose control of the car, or that dreadful moment when a kid runs out in front of you, then the autonomous car can save those lives. Let alone the benefit that it gives you from the social point of view, from freeing up your time. The reality is that this technology means nobody need ever die again, either as a driver or as a passenger or as a pedestrian. We can eliminate death on the road. That in itself is good enough reason to challenge all of the hurdles that we will have to go through to bring this technology to market. The combination of zero emission and zero fatality means that the automobile is no longer negatively contributing to society. It's no longer a pollutant. It no longer needs to be demonized as dirty. It no longer needs to be demonized as a killer. The automobile and our industry and my industry can become part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's why we feel so passionately about this technology and why we will bring the first autonomous car to market by 2020. How that works is basically, this is the technology roadmap. So today you already have what we call active safety. Active safety is the ability of the computer to look around you, the ability to keep you in lane, the ability for blind spot detection, the ability to stop the car when the car in front of you has stopped, or even stop the car when the car in front of the car has stopped. But basically, when we get to autonomous car, this is where the car has the capability to drive you from A to B without the necessity to touch the wheel. It's different from a self-driving car. We don't yet have the technology for pure self-driving. The car always has the ability, at least in our technological roadmap, to hand control back to the driver. So we can't yet imagine a day when the driver can sit in the rear and read the paper, although I look forward to that day. But certainly it can take over most of the workload and most of the time be in control and give you time and warning when the control will be handed back to the driver. And that's what the 2020 roadmap looks like. Let's look at that. So why computer? That's a kid or a youth running across the road. We've all been there. That's when you've hit the brakes and then you do everything to avoid hitting the guy. You know how quickly that happens. That's how quickly the computer senses the thing going on in front of you. It sees things in slow motion. Obviously that means it has time to react. It has time to consider the actions that the car should take. Should it stop? Should it swerve? The computer is 100 times quicker than the human brain. This is what it's looking at. I don't know about you, but when I'm driving, I'm concentrating on the road. The radars and the sensors are basically looking everywhere. You can see them here picking up signs. You can see them picking up people, little red boxes. They're looking everywhere. In fact, with the radar, they have the capability to look a few blocks away to sense everything that could go on. When there's a kid with a ball, they can even have the intelligence to imagine that the ball may get knocked out into the street and the kid may follow the ball. And they can already be computing the actions that they should take. Now, I'm sure there's some of us around the room that have capability and drive in that manner and think about the environment some of the time, but do you do it all of the time? And does everybody that drives a car really have that scope of thinking? Next is the faster human reaction. Now, this is what happens when you screw up as a chief planning officer. You get to be that guy. So you can see that it's not just about anticipating the normals, like hitting the brakes. The computer is also anticipating maybe I don't have enough braking room, and it can drive me around the obstacle. And you can see here how the computer is seeing that space. Quicker, more precise, and always calculating the way of least risk. You'll have seen on one of the earlier videos, by the way, the guy here was sitting like this. On the earlier video, when we drive these cars in Japan, the hand has to be near the wheel. It's not a matter of the guy praying that nothing will happen. He just needs to be close to the wheel in case the car hands back over control. So what are the challenges that the autonomous car faces? Well, they're big. And to be frank, there's not so much of a technology challenge. Nissan is already able from next year to say all of the technology that's required is out of advanced engineering and into application engineering, basically on a roadmap towards introduction of the technology. And we'll introduce the technology in stages. But basically, what we can produce in 2020 will be out of the labs already at the end of this year. The other challenges are not so small. Legislation, product liability. In case of a crash, even if the car had done everything possible to avoid the crash and had made the path of least damage, in a litigious society like the United States, ultimately you have to have some guidance in terms of who's responsible. Legislation, it's obviously illegal to drive today reading your social media and with your hands off the steering wheel. How do we change that legislation? If you want to use the full scope and your full benefits, allowing people to keep their licenses longer or get their licenses earlier requires changes of legislation. And perhaps the most difficult point is social acceptance. As with the electric car, it takes time for people to accept that this technology is acceptable and safe. We think there needs to be a debate, and one of the reasons, of course, for standing here is to open that debate up and talk about what it is that the industry has to do to convince the buying public that this is safe. So, when you consider the three major social trends, seniors, youths, and empowered females, when you consider the three major technical trends, zero emissions, connected vehicles, and autonomous driving, that gives plenty of space in the green area to reimagine what the car might look like and what the car might do. And we imagine many different solutions. So, for example, the fact that you no longer need the engine to be where I may say God meant it to be in front of you. You no longer have an engine. Your motors can be inside your wheels. Your battery can be your floor pan. The car no longer needs to look like the car looks today. It can look completely different. We can sit the driver at the back, the front, the side, wherever we want. We don't need to have a 3-box or a 2-box styling. And for those of you that are interested in some of the things that it's possible to do, I'd encourage you to go online and look at Blade Glider. which is an example of just changing completely the way that we think the vehicle. In this case, the driver sits in the middle and the front track is just 1 meter across the wheels, which makes, by the way, one of the most fantastic handling sports cars I've ever driven. But those same changes mean that we can imagine or reimagine the use of the car, be it car sharing or just simply the use of the autonomous car. I would also argue in that space, the taxi becomes an important asset. It's kind of car sharing. Today, the taxi is part of the problem of pollution. If one goes to Westminster, nearly 50% of the particulates in Westminster come from the 22,000 taxis that run around the city centre. Imagine you could get rid of that particulates. Imagine the impact that will have on childhood asthma, for example. Imagine that you can make those vehicles autonomous and the impact that that will have on traffic congestion through the capital cities of the world. Whilst the taxi has always been maybe viewed as the lower end of the spectrum, and often the second-hand taxi or the old-style taxi, Nissan has decided to bring the taxi to the forefront and make it a symbol of our brand. That's why we participated and won the New York Taxi of Tomorrow. And that's why we've decided to enter the business of selling London taxis. This is our London taxi. It's based on the NV200, obviously restyled to look like a London cab, and meets all of the prerequisite requirements of a London taxi, with the 25-foot turning circle and the space for the bale of hay in the front seat, which is very important. Now, having decided to make the taxi, obviously we've also decided to bring the electric cab. Again, be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so in making that decision, we had to find somewhere to make the new cab of London, or the new cab of the UK. And today I'm extremely pleased and honoured to be able to make an announcement for the first time that we're going to make the new Nissan London cab in Coventry. So a company called ADV has been appointed today to make the new cab. It will do all of the final assembly, and everything that makes it a London cab will be done here in Coventry. There will be a £6 million investment in creating a brand new facility in Coventry, and that's with the help of Nissan, with ADV, and also with a government program which will facilitate loans to make that possible. And obviously that's going to create new jobs in and around Coventry. And as I said, our commitment is that by 2015 we will sell the electric cab to a city in the UK. That concludes the look at the impacts of the megatrends within the industry. At the end of the lecture, I just wanted to touch on the importance of higher education, since we're in a great university establishment, and talk about the needs that my industry needs from academia. We need to, as the UK, invest in the auto industry. The UK is now the third biggest maker of automobiles in Europe. It's still a significant force. And as I said, Sunderland by itself makes more cars than the whole of Italy put together. But to make that sustainable and to ensure that companies like Nissan continue to invest, it's important that we invest not only in manufacturing but also in engineering and technology. And for that we need people with the right background and education. And within that, I already mentioned the power of the empowered female. We need more women. That means that we need people coming out of universities with maths-based education, be it maths, be it physics, be it engineering. We need that skill base. And probably as importantly, we need to promote the vocational skills that used to be apparent and I believe are now becoming more apparent out of apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are absolutely key to our industry and key to the basic, what the Japanese would call gemba, work floor skills. So people that leave school at 16, it's not a case of abandoning their careers. We want to be able to take those people, bring them through a different form of education, ultimately allowing them to catch a degree in a different way. And of course we need the graduates, you guys, basically coming out with maths-based training. And maths-based training isn't just about working in engineering. It's now based on almost everything that I'm responsible for in the company, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, customer relations, ISIT, maths is everywhere. Here's an example of marketing, which I took responsibility in Nissan 3 years ago. It may seem a long way from engineering, but actually it's not that far, because maths and big data that I've described helps you to work out who you're talking to, helps you to rifle shot your marketing messages, makes your return on investment for the marketing dollar. And Nissan spends around $4 billion every year on marketing, helps you to target the customer that you're looking for. This is the purchasing funnel. This is some of the maths around the purchasing funnel. This is a correlation. No, we can go to the next page. We can go to the correlation here. Overall opinion is basically what drives your brand. It's what overall opinion means. I like or I really like the Nissan car or the Micra or the Qashqai. The higher the overall opinion, generally speaking, the less discount one needs to give, and the higher the market share. And you can see here, this is market share, and this is a correlation curve. We've taken off the names of the competitors for some reason. But I don't remember which country this one is. United States, so it has an R-square of 0.8887. Someone being a little over-precise, but 0.9 correlation. It's almost perfect correlation between what people, the overall opinion that people give of your car and your market share. Maths, statistics. We can use it everywhere. The last point of education is, frankly speaking, we need more females in our industry. So these are the statistics I mentioned earlier. Globally, 50% of women are dissatisfied with their car. To be frank, we as an industry design our cars around a 95 percentile US male, which means that the ergonomics for most women are not great. 74% of US women feel misunderstood by automakers. That's either with the car that we give them or the way that our marketing messages work. Nissan's own research says that 60% or even as high as 70% in some places of the car purchasing decision is made by women. So it makes sense for us to address that very important segment. Nissan, and I don't think we're untypical, employs less than 10% female managers in our ranks. So how can we have 60 or 70% of our customers being female, but only have 10% of our managers making the decisions for those people? It's not right. It's not right, and it's not untypical of our industry. So we most definitely, through education and through the recruitment policy and the promotion policy and the way that we think about things like maternity care, have to change the way that we bring and utilize women in the development of cars. And for example, right now, a little over 50% of the marketing department in Nissan is female, as we try to make the best of that. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that I've given you an insight into the next 40 years of the automobile. I'll reiterate that I do believe that we're on the cusp of a huge change in the industry, probably the most important change in the industry since Daimler invented the motor car. That change isn't just a figment of my imagination, that it's driven by the social trends and the technology trends. It's driven by the megacities. It's given by the movement of society. It's given by the fact that we live longer, that we allow, fortunately, society to give more power to females, that youth have a changing approach to the way that the car should be, that we have the technology to bring zero emissions and zero fatalities, and that nobody now need ever die on the road again or breathe bad air, and that the automobile is finally part of the solution and not part of the problem. Thank you very much.